Today, we're going to be using Azure Analysis Services as a semantic endpoint, and this actually will conclude our series on creating the reference architecture for Azure SQL DB. So very excited about that. A couple brief announcements. First of all, we just got up a brand new course on our teachable courses on learn.timextender.com. This course is about creating a trial license and a sandbox setup. So in connection with that, we also have the ability to go into the user portal and sign in, create a new account fresh, and create a trial license of TimeXtender. So this allows anybody to be able to trial the TimeXtender solution. So it's important to be aware of. All the partners should be aware of this, as well as customers. But it's just a nice way to be able to try out TimeXtender. If you don't already have a partner and don't already have a connection with somebody, you can just go in and create that trial. Now, this course walks you through creating a sandbox environment, essentially on your local PC or maybe just a sandbox VM. But just using the developer edition of SQL Server, creating a nice, small local environment to be able to test out TimeXtender for free. So go ahead and check that out if you haven't already. The other thing I would like to announce that I'm very excited about is a new feature that was just released in version 20.10.17. You can go and see that in the user portal. Just go to support.timextender.com, find the click for downloads, and you'll see you can download the latest version. So the new feature that's available in this release is the retry steps in the ODX tasks. Excited about that feature. This is going to allow you to be able to retry a task in the ODX if that task has failed or completed with errors.
Hang on, Joseph, I got to jump in here. So we could do this before with the execution packages in TimeXtender, right?
Yes, so this was supported in execution packages. Great question. However, it was never supported in the ODX tasks. So yeah, super excited about this. And this is a very important feature because when you're using the ODX, typically, most times you're going to be on Azure, you're going to be communicating with an Azure data lake. And when you're using these technologies, it's very common to have what's called transient errors, right? So you're passing commands, you're passing information, excuse me, through the internet, right? These pieces of information are traveling through tons of different routers and all of these different places. And so you can naturally just have some connections, a certain percentage of connections that get dropped during that process. And that's what's known as just a typical network transient error. These are well within Azure's SLAs, and they're very aware of this. And so how to get around that is simply setting up a retry logic within your application. That's essentially what this is here, allowing you to retry these tasks after they have, if they fail or if a task completes with errors. So check out that new feature, download the latest version if you haven't already. Okay. So as is typical for this series, we are covering our TimeXtender reference architecture with Azure SQL Database. We've been going over the sessions for a while now, creating the app server, the repository, the ODX on data lake, the MDW as a SQL database, using Azure Data Factory, and now, of course, setting up analysis services as a semantic layer endpoint. So this is the final session in this series. Very excited to get on to some new and different things in the future. So yes, and as Jay mentioned, we do have all the previous sessions recorded and available in YouTube. So if you want to go and check those out, they are up there ready for you to see. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So before you get started, there are a couple things you need to know. If you want to follow along today, you're going to need a few prerequisites. access to the Azure portal and permissions to create resources, of course, as always. You also want a TimeXtender application server already spun up and the ODX storage configured. You're also going to need an app registration available in your Azure Active Directory. So I will be using the app registration I created in a previous session. And so if you want to know how to do that, you can go back to the data lake session and see how that gets created. I'm just going to be using the same app registration in this case. You can, of course, use a different one if you prefer, but I'll be using the existing one that I have. Okay, so to use Azure Analysis Services as a semantic layer endpoint, here are the steps. You can follow along in the knowledge base. We do have this guide, use Azure. And these are the steps that I'm going to be following today. And of course, the first step is to create the Azure Analysis Services resource in the Azure portal. So let me go ahead and open up the Azure portal. And here I am in my TimeXtender Tuesdays resource group. We do have all the previous resources that I have already created, the data factory, the storage account, the SQL server. Let's go ahead and add a new resource. I'll click add here at the top and I'll search for analysis services. Have that right there. So this will bring me to analysis services. I can go ahead and click create. So need to enter the name here. So I'm going to call this TX Tuesdays. And then we have the subscriptions already defined, the resource group, again, already doing this within my resource group. The location is important. You want to try to co-locate this in the same data center as your other resources that you've been working on. And again, this is just going to reduce latency when communicating across these multiple different resources. The pricing tier is important. Azure Analysis Services is one of the more expensive resources in Azure. So you want to be sure that you understand that and that you're creating and selecting a pricing tier that's going to be affordable for you. I'm going to be using the D1 instance, and this is the least expensive one. You can actually click view pricing details and see these different options and how much they cost. Our pricing, because our main tenant is actually based out of Denmark, our pricing is in Danish krone here. And so you can see that the developer edition, the D1, is actually the cheapest option. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that D1 for this case. Okay. You can see here it's automatically setting my name, my email address as the administrator. I'm going to go ahead and leave that. And backup storage settings, I'm just going to leave alone. And storage key expiration, I'm going to leave that alone as well. So I will go ahead and click create. And this is going to create that analysis services resource for me. So this is going to take just a few minutes. And once that gets created, I'm going to, of course, use my app registration that I have and give that app registration access as an analysis services administrator. We actually have to do that through Management Studio. If you don't already have an app registration created, I'll show you quickly how to do that while that's getting spun up. We go to Azure Active Directory. And on the left-hand side, you can just click on App Registrations. And here you can create a new registration. I have an existing registration that I'm going to be using, TX Tuesdays. And in that registration, we have certificates and secrets. And of course, this is where you can create the secret, right? So I have my secret. It gets hidden there. It actually doesn't show you. So you have to save that in a safe place. So you have your app ID, which you'll need, and then the secret. So the app ID is your username, the secret is your password. So our analysis services endpoint has now been created. Fantastic. Great. So now what I need is I need the analysis services server name. And if you go to that analysis services resource, you have the server name right here in the top right. You go ahead and click copy. And now we want to set that as an analysis services endpoint, or analysis services admin rather. And so that's my second step here. Now we go ahead, and this is going to be different than some of the other resources. If you remember in the previous sessions, we did this previously through access control. However, with analysis services, it's just slightly different in how you set this up. So we're actually going to be doing this through Management Studio. So let me open up Management Studio. And I have here SQL Server Management Studio, and I can paste in the server name for that Azure Analysis Services. And I'm going to sign in using Azure Active Directory Universal with multi-factor authentication. So I'll click connect. Again, that email address, my email address, is set as an Azure Analysis Services admin already. So I will have access to this database. Okay, so I need to approve the sign-in request on my phone here. Great. So this will get me signed in and connected to that Azure Analysis Services. It's taking a little bit longer than usual.
Joseph, while we're waiting, we did have a question from Peter Jensen.
Mm-hmm.
Can TimeXtender in the future or soon be able to generate a tabular model for Power BI Premium, the XMLA endpoint? A follow-up, will TimeXtender then also support the new features of Power BI Premium?
Yep, that's a fantastic question. As of right now, our focus in the development team is primarily on functionality and, of course, relational databases. So that's where we're focusing our efforts, given that Microsoft is moving in a brand new direction here with analysis services with Power BI Premium. A lot of functionality is being placed into an in-user platform. For example, in this case, it's Power BI, to be able to manage and maintain these XML endpoints. And so the ability to manage that from TimeXtender, we believe, isn't actually adding a lot of end-user value to the customer. And so we believe that the best place to build and maintain those Power BI data sets is going to be from within Power BI. So that's how we're moving forward with that. So we currently don't have any plans to integrate with Power BI Premium XMLA public endpoints. So great question. Okay, so we got connected to our analysis services server. Right here, we can right click and click on properties on our server. And then we want to go to security here on the left-hand side. We see here server administrators, and I'm going to click add. So I want to add an administrator here. It's just going to verify my account. And I want to add, again, my app registration I already have. That app registration is called TX Tuesdays. And I'll just type that in and hit search. And we can see that shows up right here. We have the app ID. And then, of course, my tenant ID is listed after that. So you want to check this app ID, make sure this matches the app ID of the app registration you're using. Select that and go ahead and click add. So that's going to add that app registration as an analysis services administrator. Go ahead and click OK. Great. So we have that added. So now what we can do is we can add in this analysis services endpoint as a global database in our app server. So here is my app server that I've, again, created there in Azure with TimeXtender up and running. We can go to environment properties, and we have here our global databases. So I click on new global database, and this is going to be analysis services, Azure Analysis Services, actually. And the type is going to be semantic. And of course, the subtype is analysis services tabular endpoint here. Go ahead and click OK. And we can put in our settings. So first of all is the server name. Paste in that server name like I already have. Again, that's on the overview page of the analysis services resource in the Azure portal. Next is the database name. Now this database is going to get generated when I deploy TimeXtender. So I can create a database right now. I'm going to call this TX_sales because we are going to create a sales model here eventually. And then we're going to call this prod because this is my prod environment. TX sales prod. The deployment target here is going to be, we can leave that as automatic. TimeXtender will detect the deployment target automatically, and compatibility level we can leave blank. Now the server login, this is how TimeXtender is going to authenticate to analysis services and ensure it has permissions to create models. So I'm going to use an authentication login here, and we're going to use the app registration that we've created already. And we have to type this in a very unique way. And this, you put APP colon, so app colon, and then the app ID of your app registration. So I have that saved on the side here. Just going to copy that and paste that in. So I have, again, authentication login, you put app APP colon, and then the app ID that you have. Let's maximize this so we can see it a little bit easier. Okay. And then next is the server password. So this is going to be the secret, of course, for that app registration. So this is going to tell, attempt to authenticate with Azure Analysis Services. It's going to tell Azure Analysis Services, hey, this is me. I'm this app ID and the secret. And because I programmed that as a server administrator, it's going to be able to authenticate and have access to create models in there. Now, the next username and password here is how Azure Analysis Services is going to get access to the database. Now, if you remember here from our diagram, we have Azure Analysis Services is going to attempt to extract data from our SQL database. So it needs to authenticate to say, hey, I actually have permissions to extract, to read this data. So let me in. And so we need to put in the username and password that can authenticate with that SQL database. So I have that saved over on the side here. And I will go ahead and paste those in now. We're not going to be using a service account. We want to use a Windows user. In this case, it's called Windows user. Now, technically, this is actually a SQL user that we're using, but this is what's going to allow us to insert a username and password. So you define Windows user, and then the username for this Azure SQL database or the Azure SQL server that you're using for your MDW, and then the password. Okay, so we have that as well. And then here you can select whether to process the model offline or if this endpoint is active. I'm going to leave those as default for now. We will then go ahead and click OK. So that is going to create that global database for me. Now, the next step here is to create a semantic model. So I want to add a semantic model. I'm going to call this sales. I just want to select and use the analysis services tabular features. Click OK. We have our sales model. And of course, we can define our endpoint. Here, I'm going to use my global setting and select Azure Analysis Services. We can call this Azure Analysis Services there. Great. So we have that. The next thing we need is we need a role. So we need to ensure that side of myself can actually read the data that's in this database. So when I have other external users connecting to analysis services from Power BI, we want to make sure they can read this data, they can see this data. And so how we do that is by defining a group and adding that group and giving that group reader access using the roles here in TimeXtender. So first of all, I need to find a group, and I can do that in Azure Active Directory. Go to Azure Active Directory here, and we scroll down and we find our groups. So we have groups, and then we can go through and we see different groups here. We have a group that we use to manage all the content for TimeXtender Tuesdays, and we call that mini lessons. So this group, I can take that and I can just copy the object ID, right? So we want to copy that because when we enter this into TimeXtender, it does unique format. So I can click Add Role. And here we're going to just call this role Readers. And I want to add external users. So to add a group as an external user in TimeXtender, you have to type it in like this: obj or object, colon, and then that object ID, okay? And then we need to put the @ symbol and our tenant ID. Oops. So let's get that. So we go back here again to Azure Active Directory, and on the front page, we're going to have our tenant ID. Copy that over, and then we just paste that right in here, okay? So again, obj colon, the object ID of that group, the @ symbol, and then your tenant ID, okay? Click Add, we have that in there, and then we click OK. So that's just the formatting that Azure Active Directory accepts its objects. So that's how you have to put it in there. Okay, so we have that added. We'll click OK. Now our external users or anyone in that group can read the data we're bringing out to Azure Analysis Services. Excuse me. Now, lastly here, I want to bring a table in. So I'm going to bring my customer table from my data warehouse, and we simply drag and drop that over to tables on my model. We can pick the fields that I want. In this case, we'll just bring a few in here: account number, customer ID, modified date, and we can just leave it at that. Okay, just bringing a few fields in just to test, make sure I have access. And lastly, I can right click here and deploy and execute my model. I'll click Start. Again, this is going to create a new version of my project for me. Added analysis endpoint, and click Save. So this is going to deploy the endpoint. It's going to first authenticate, make sure that, oh yeah, you have this app registration. It is set as an administrator, so you do have permissions. It's going to create that model in the analysis services server there, create a new model for us. And then, of course, it's going to, once that model gets deployed, it's going to execute that model. So it's going to extract the data from the SQL database, the Azure SQL database serverless we have here, programmed for the MDW, and it's going to bring that data into the model. Finally, we can open up Power BI and we can see the data stored in analysis services. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Power BI here. Give it just a second to warm up. And then we can connect to that analysis services model. So I'm going to click here, Get Data. And I want to select Azure Analysis Services. See if that's here. We'll go to Azure Analysis Services Database. Hit Connect. And we want to put in the server name again of that analysis services server, which I have here. Paste that in. Oops. Okay. And you don't need to put in the database name. It's optional, it says. We do want to connect live. This is important because Azure Analysis Services is the same technology that's actually built into Power BI itself. So importing the database doesn't actually have a lot of value. It just adds time. And so you want to do the connect live whenever connecting to analysis services from Power BI. There's very rare cases where you might not want to do that, but typically always connect live. So we'll click OK. This will connect to that database. And then, of course, it's going to check, okay, you are actually in that group that we added for security. And okay, seems like it's having a bit of a delay here, trying to connect to the analysis services database. Here we go. All right, so it connected to the server. It found this database, this model, and I have my sales model right in there, my sales cube. Click OK, and then I have my customer table available. Beautiful. So I'm going to create a new table, and we're just going to drop in some of these fields here. Make sure we're bringing in data. And it looks like I have some data, so that is great. So we're bringing data into analysis service. We're able to create the model and deploy that as an endpoint in TimeXtender. Awesome.